You're watching Maverick Media. Educate, organize, act.
Could we just slip back a little bit? Sure. Because of this whole movement to cover up things, there's so much that the American people don't know. So could you, just for the edification of our audience, could you talk a little bit about Iran-Contra and the October surprise, how Reagan got into office in the first place?
Right. Well, this is sort of one of those funny stories because we learned part of it and then you have to sort of go back in time.
Right.
Instead of it being sort of a narrative, you start at one place and you move to the end. Iran-Contra was when people were shocked to find out in 1986 that the Reagan administration was secretly selling arms to Iran, which had been governed by Ayatollah Khomeini since 1979. It was a radical Islamic state. It had held, back in 1979, 52 Americans had been seized as hostages. That hostage crisis had lasted 444 days. Iran's government was seen as very disreputable. It had been involved, became involved in a war with Iraq starting in 1980, which went on for 8 years. So in the middle of this, we begin to find out that Reagan's people were tilting in one way to Iraq, secretly providing them assistance, but also selling weapons to the Iranians, basically working both sides. Now, so we begin to sort of unpeel this onion, and we end up finding that there was a whole network of arms dealers and how they were functioning, and often we learned that Israel was a key middleman in this operation, which also seems odd to people because people thought of Israel being an enemy of Iran. Iran used to talk about the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel. But there was a whole different reality that began to come into focus with Iran-Contra. That sometimes what people say, even when they're denouncing each other, isn't really what's happening behind the scenes. They can be collaborating. So Iran-Contra became a story partly of how to understand what happened. And the way it was sort of sold to us at that time was that this begins about 84, 85, when there are some overtures from the Iranians who want some weapons. The Israelis sort of intervene to sort of help that happen. The Reagan people agree because Iran's offering to help with some other hostage crisis in Lebanon. And ultimately, the U.S. takes over the shipments directly. First, they do it through Israel, then later more directly from American stockpiles. But that turns out only to be part of the story. What we learn later as we go through this is that the weapons shipments did not begin in 1985 and 86. They actually get traced back further and further in time. And we learned that certainly by 81, at the very start of the Reagan presidency, the U.S. government was approving Israeli sales of weapons to Iran. And one of the shipments actually was shot down in June of 1981, because it's straight over the Soviet Union and was shot down. And we learned later from a guy who was the Assistant Secretary of State, Nicholas Veliotis, that he had gone to his higher-ups and said, what's happening with this, what's going on here? And he learned from them that this was an approved U.S. government operation, and he came to believe that the actual connections between the Republicans and the Iranians dated back to the campaign of 1980, and that Reagan's people were in touch with the Iranians then. And this fit with various allegations that had started to come out from arms dealers, intelligence operatives, who had said they were part of this operation. And they began to describe in some detail the way these deals actually began. And so you have to go back then to 1980. And I was hired actually by Public Broadcasting's Frontline program to look into this. And what we discovered was that there was substantial evidence that after the hostage crisis begins in 1979, Jimmy Carter, President Carter, who's fighting for his political survival, is desperately trying to get the hostages out. And he's finding that the Israelis, the Likud government of Menachem Begin, is interfering with him. They're trying to do deals with the Iranians. And Carter finds out in March of '80 that there actually had been a shipment from Israel to the Iranians. And he's furious, and he confronts Begin. Begin is very angry with Carter because Carter had pushed him into the Camp David peace agreement, where Israel had surrendered the Sinai back to Egypt in exchange for an Egyptian agreement for peace. Now that might sound like a good thing to many people, but Begin was very upset about it. And the Likud was very afraid that if Carter got a second term, he would force them to make a fuller deal with the Palestinians. That Israel would be forced into a two-state solution, which at that time it did not want. So for the Israelis, they saw Carter's re-election in 1980 as a tremendous threat. So it appears they began collaborating with the Republicans, who had their own interests, obviously, in seeing Carter defeated. And other groups sort of got involved too. The Saudis did not want Carter in. They felt he was weak. They did not want to have happen to them what had happened to the Shah of Iran in 1979 when he was thrown out. So there was certain commonality of interest. Carter, it turned out, was facing a lot of people whose interests were diametrically opposed to his. And there were also conservative European politicians and intelligence people who thought that Carter was being too soft on the Soviet Union. They wanted to ratchet up the Cold War again. So basically, there are a lot of people willing to collaborate with the Republicans in these contacts with the Iranians to see that Carter didn't get credit for getting the hostages out, and that the hostage crisis would continue as kind of an albatross around Carter's neck, which it did. It so happened, coincidentally, that the first anniversary of the hostage crisis was the day of the election in 1980. So Americans were really focused on this humiliation that they'd been subjected to for a year. And it played into Reagan's message that the United States needs to be tougher, stronger. We need to build up our military again, be respected in the world. So it just played very well for Reagan, played very badly for Carter. And after the election, which Reagan won rather decisively, then the settlement was finally reached with the Iranians, and almost simultaneous with Reagan being sworn in on January 20th, '81, the hostages are released to a great celebration in the United States. And the American people, therefore, had this impression that Ronald Reagan was a tough guy who could get things done. So it was a very important impetus to the start of the Reagan presidency that here was Reagan being sworn in, our enemies, the Iranians, cough up the hostages. And the Republicans put out this joke. There was a joke which was, what's 3 feet deep and glows in the dark? And the answer was Tehran 10 minutes after Ronald Reagan becomes president. So the idea was that if we're tough with our enemies, they will do what we want. And so that was an important message to get started, and it helped carry Reagan through much of his first term. This idea that he was this guy who was not this uninvolved guy on the international stage. He could actually be a real player. So it also cemented the idea of Carter being a weakling and the Democrats being weak. So it was a very important political development.
What do you say to Barbara Honecker's book on October Surprise, where she says that the negotiations were specifically to not release the hostages until the day that Reagan was inaugurated, which is what happened?
Well, there's a lot of evidence to support that. I mean, Barbara Honecker's done some good work. the problem with some of this is that, as with any of these very sensitive secrets, there's an old line from Churchill that Bill Casey, the CIA director, was Reagan's campaign manager in 1980, liked to say, and it was, the truth is so valuable, it must be protected by a battalion of lies. And so what would happen sometimes is that there'd be people who would intervene into these stories who would tell you some things that were partly true, and they would tell you some things that weren't. And you had to be very careful to evaluate these kinds of people. And there were some real witnesses, real sources, and then there were people like this. And sometimes some of them, Barbara, I think, was a bit too trusting of some of those people. I mean, she's not a trained journalist. She was a person in the Reagan administration, and so at some point, those kinds of people, then they detonate behind you after you've used them. Then they can say, "Well, see, I was making stuff up," and that discredits the whole story, even though the story may be very real. So you have that problem, and it requires a lot of care not to be burned like that, and it's very hard not to be in some cases, because these are stories where there are very intricate pieces of them. And you do have someone who actually seems to know part of a story, but then might give you some element of it that's wrong.
How do the repercussions from them play out now?
Well, Americans just don't know that history at all. I mean, the October surprise story is still considered very questionable. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that it was a conspiracy theory run wild. And despite the fact that there's enormous hard evidence, we have documents, we have witnesses, we have essentially a very filled up narrative of how it occurred. It was attacked aggressively, not just by the Republicans, but by some key elements of the news media. The New Republic, which has switched from being a liberal paper or magazine to a neoconservative one, did a hatchet job on the topic. Newsweek, my old colleagues at Newsweek, went after it and also attacked it. A very poorly done congressional investigation was put together under Congressman Lee Hamilton, which concocted absurd alibis for people to say they couldn't have been involved in this. One of my favorite alibis they used was that on some key date for Bill Casey, who was then the director of the Reagan campaign, the investigation said that because someone had written down his home phone number on a certain date, that proved that Casey was at home. And when you ask, when you say, well, was there a phone call? The person who wrote down the name said, I had no recollection of actually calling Casey. There's no record of the call going through. But because someone had written down Casey's home phone number, that was considered conclusive proof that Casey was at home. These are like absurd arguments. But they were put together by this congressional investigation, and which was finishing its work in late '92 and early '93. And they basically sort of judged that nothing had happened on this. Later on, I was able to access some of their documents, and they left boxes of documents behind. And in late '94, after the Republicans won control of Congress, I figured this is my last chance probably to get hold of some of these documents. So I convinced some folks on the House Foreign Affairs Committee to let me access them. And I was led to this room, this office I never knew existed. It was in the Rayburn House parking garage. And it was sort of an overflow kind of office, I guess, for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and led to the back of these warren of offices, and there was an abandoned ladies' room. And in the abandoned ladies' room, they had dumped these boxes of documents that they had generated in this October surprise investigation. And they were supposedly just the unclassified material, but I started opening up these documents, and they'd left behind secret and top secret material. So the person who was there supposedly watching me was sort of busy with other stuff, so I volunteered to photostat the documents myself and covered up the top secret and there was this big old copier that kept breaking down. I'd volunteer to fix it, and was able to sort of to extract some of these documents. They limited me to 12 copies each visit, so I went back several times. I was able to extract the best, I thought, of the 36 or so pages I was allowed. But these documents were remarkable in that what it made clear was that this House investigation had, especially toward the end of its time, was being flooded with evidence that indeed the October surprise story was true. that that the Republicans had pulled this off. Yet they went ahead and they sent out, and I later learned from the chief counsel, Larry Barcella, because I called him up at one point and said, how could you let this stuff go? And he said, well, the truth is that he had, because so much was coming in late in the investigation about the Republicans actually having done this, he went to Lee Hamilton, the chairman, and said, we have to extend the investigation several months to evaluate all this evidence. And Hamilton said, no, that would require me going back and getting an extension from the Congress, and let's just wrap it up and say nothing happened. So they basically put out a report. They put together a report which went to the printers in January of 1993, and just weeks before Bill Clinton gets inaugurated. It was due out on January 13th, the week before Bill Clinton was to be inaugurated. And then, to their surprise, on January 11th, the Russian government, in perhaps an unprecedented step of cooperation with the United States, sent a report to Lee Hamilton. Because Hamilton had sort of approached them as he'd approached others and said, what do you have in your intelligence files on this topic? And the Russians sent a report saying that the Republicans had these meetings in Paris and Madrid with the Iranians, that they named a number of the people involved. They described some things I had never heard of, some dealings also that Carter was trying to do on his part. The Russians had a very good feel for this, according to this report. They had their own intelligence files. They obviously were following Iran very closely. And then we know they penetrated European intelligence. They actually had penetrated the CIA and U.S. intelligence, we now know. So they had all this information, and they deliver it to Lee Hamilton on January 11th. The report's already gone to the printers. So what do? What Lee Hamilton did was they stuck it in this box, and it ended up getting dumped in this ladies' room. And they didn't release it to the American people. It was classified. I asked Barcella, I said, why didn't you just release their report? Because obviously if they had released it at that time, they'd have to also admit that their report, which was already at the printers, wasn't worth the paper that it was being printed on, if the Russians were telling the truth and were right. So they put this report away, and when I asked Barcella, well, why didn't they just at least release that, declassify it and release it? He said, well, it was classified, Bob, and it would require us having gone through some steps to declassify it. And then Barcella said, I kind of envisioned it like that last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, where they're taking the Ark and they're going into this warehouse, and it's being shoved into this giant government warehouse. He said, I kind of envisioned the documents ending up there. So, so he knew. Here was the chief counsel, and he knew they had taken a dive, at least to the level that they did not examine some of this very powerful evidence that they were getting at the end of the investigation. So, I mean, that in a sense is how our history gets done. And if you don't get lucky, if people aren't out there digging and to some degree getting lucky, finding stuff, it remains hidden for the American people probably forever.
Yeah, for our viewers, I just want to interject very quickly. One of the reasons we're getting into the October surprise here is as an example of one case of something that was very important that the American people knew nothing about, or knew very little about. And if we had time with Robert, we could probably go into dozens of similar stories that the American people have no idea about what happened. So, Robert, how does that play out with what's going on in Iran now? Is there any connection with what happened way back then and our relationship with Iran now? Or what's going on in the Middle East now?
Well, it's always dangerous when a country doesn't know the history of its relationship with another country. The American people, if they are indeed going to be supposedly the people in charge in a democracy, in a democratic republic, need to know what the facts are. Otherwise, they're just children being played with. Now, it's easy to sell people a story if they don't know all this fairly complex history, at least to some level. And Americans don't know this. They don't know really the history of our relationship with Iraq. The Iraq-Gate scandal of the Reagan-Bush people giving weapons and material to Saddam Hussein also was hidden from the American people pretty effectively. So you have this. We end up being put into these conflicts where the government gets to tell us kind of the narrative. And it's not necessarily the real narrative. It can be essentially a false narrative. It can be something that if you knew the facts, you'd say, that's not right. So in the case of Iran, there are not only the fact that there was this curious relationship between the Republicans and the Iranians going back to this period, also many of the key figures who in the Iran-Contra scandal from the Iranian side are still around. And interestingly, they're what we now call the opposition. And this is a significant point because, again, the American press has chosen not to sort of exclude certain facts from the debate about Iran now. For instance, it was reported a couple of years ago, and we've sort of had this confirmed, that George W. Bush signed a intelligence finding to spend roughly $400 million on destabilizing the Iranian government. And that was considered fairly a good idea among many people at the time. But what that included was efforts to build up a political opposition, to have regime change in Iran. Yet, what's been left out of these stories when we talk about the election in Iran on June 12th of 2009 is the fact that there is reason for the Iranians to suspect, whether rightly or wrongly, that the United States is trying to mess up their political situation. Something the United States, of course, did back in 1953 with the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh. So it's not like this is completely far-fetched. This has a history to it. And just a year or two ago, we were reporting about this $400 million plan that George Bush had to wreak havoc. So, so the Iranians are freaked out. They think that we see the people involved in the opposition might have some ties to foreign interests to sort of change their government. Whether or not that should happen or not is another question, but that's certainly a concern that the Iranian government has. It turns out also that that three of the key figures in the opposition had long-time relationships with the Israelis and the United States. You have, for instance, Mousavi, who was the leader of the opposition now. He was prime minister back in the 1980s. He was dealing with the Israelis and with the Americans. He was essentially Ghebanafar's control officer. And Ghebanavar was the Iranian who was dealing with Michael Ledeen, the neoconservative working for the State Department, and Oliver North. So when Ollie North and Bud McFarlane, the National Security Advisor, were flying over to Iran with the Bible and the cake, which was sort of the infamous event, they were going to meet Mousavi. So Mousavi's had this relationship with the Americans through and with the Israelis. Rafsanjani, another key figure in the Iranian opposition, was essentially made a wealthy man because of the arms deals that he was handling with the Israelis. And Karoubi, who's perhaps the most controversial member of this opposition triumvirate, was a guy who was implicated in the October surprise. He was one of the guys who allegedly met with Casey and others in the American government to try to sabotage Carter's efforts to get the hostages out. He and his brother, Hassan Karoubi, then were like key figures later on, when you get to the 85-86 timeframe, of arranging the weapons that the Americans sent through Israel to Iran. So you have these three guys who have intelligence ties to the Israelis and the Americans. Now that's the sort of fact that, maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe these guys are not at this time working for the Americans or the Israelis. But that's the kind of detail that the American people should be told, because it does bear on what's happening in Iran. But you can't find that. Even though some of this is in Walsh's Iran-Contra report, the official investigative report on Iran-Contra, it sort of has it's gone into the memory hole. There have also been books that have described these details. But again, they're not raised by the New York Times or the Washington Post or the other major news organizations, which seem to have joined the campaign to gin up this hatred of Iran, much as they did in 2002 and 2003 about Iraq. In both cases, this inconvenient history has been shunted aside, and very few Americans know it.
I don't think very many Americans know about Mossadegh.
Well, in 1953, Prime Minister Mossadegh, who was a democratically elected leader of Iran, wanted to nationalize Iranian oil reserves, which had been controlled mostly by the British. This was one of the early stages of the CIA, and the British intelligence and the CIA got together to overthrow Mossadegh. And at one point, when I was working on the October Surprise story for PBS Frontline, I had the chance to interview Miles Copeland, who was one of the CIA officers who had engaged in this. And we sat down and he described how in '53 he and Kermit Roosevelt, Archie Roosevelt, and other legendary CIA officers got together and went into Iran with bags of money, and they spread the money around at the bazaars to get people to go and demonstrate against Mossadegh. They also did propaganda campaign against Mossadegh, portraying him as kind of a flaky guy. They pointed out that he'd wear his bathrobe in his office, things like that, to sort of undermine him with the Iranian people. And ultimately, this was successful in forcing Mossadegh out. And Mossadegh was replaced by the Shah of Iran, who was willing to more or less play ball with the U.S. and the Brits. So it was the way that the United States and Great Britain did intervene in Iranian affairs very successfully from the point of view of the Americans and the Brits to put their guy back in power and get rid of this guy who wanted to nationalize the oil reserves. So it's a good example of how during that period especially, the CIA was very proud of its ability to intervene in these different countries and put in the people that the U.S. wanted and get rid of those that the U.S. did not want.
The American people are told repeatedly that we are going to the aid of our allies and the support of democracies, but Mossadegh was democratically elected.
Well, there is this tendency to sort of like democracy when the results are what the United States wanted, and then hate it when it's not. You know, there's the case of Algeria where there was an election in the '90s and the Islamists won, and that wasn't the right answer. So the Islamists were blocked from taking power. The Algerian military took control and essentially started a civil war and slaughtered many of the Islamists. We've seen more recently in Palestine where there was an election that the Bush administration pushed for, but Hamas won. And that was sort of the wrong answer. So the United States has then ratcheted up the pain on the Palestinians as sort of punishment for voting the wrong way. So there is this tendency to do that. There's also this idea that you can do sort of what they call velvet revolutions, where the U.S. pours money into one side and uses the propaganda techniques that have been very well refined by now. And then there'll be immediate claims by let's say that the U.S. backside doesn't win. It will immediately claim it did win. And then there'll be demonstrations and protests demanding that the side that the U.S. did not like, that may have actually won, step down in favor of the side that really lost. And we've seen that technique used. And that's what the Iranians suspect is happened after the June election, because Mousavi, even before a single vote was counted, declared that he was the victor. And then when the tallies came in favoring Ahmadinejad, Ahmadinejad's people said, "No, we won." And then Mousavi said, "No, you didn't. It was rigged. It was fraud." And there's been really no evidence of fraud. There's been basically what Mousavi's side really claims is that Ahmadinejad's side had provided jobs, pay raises, and food to many of the poor people, and that led the poor people to vote for Ahmadinejad. And the Mousavi people feel that's unfair. And one can argue that it was unfair, but that's more machine politics, not fraud. And so, but the fraud message has been sold by the New York Times and the Washington Post and other major news organizations uncritically to the American people. And there's a real question. It's very possible that Ahmadinejad won legitimately.